yay. And though I lived in Greenback, I was a country girl. I lived outside the city about 3 miles, so I was a country girl.
Okay. Okay, Judy.
My family roots don't go that deep in Greenback, but you know, when you think about it, I've been here all my life. I was 1 year old when my family moved from Alcoa. My grandfather and his 2 daughters and their husbands decided they'd like to farm, and they'd never farmed before in their life. So we bought a 365-acre dairy farm outside Greenback and moved and learned to farm by farming. My Uncle Frank King, this was Cleophas Franklin was my dad, and Frank King was my uncle. And my Uncle Frank King had been in the World War II and went to school, to farming school on the GI Bill. So he learned a little about farming, and the rest we just learned as we went. We started out with a borrowed tractor, someone Daddy worked with at the aluminum company, let us borrow an old Minneapolis Moline, Dad says. And so we started with that one tractor and put in a crop and kept going until we had bought 2 more farms, one for each of our families. And so it was quite successful, but it was hard work. And that's pretty much what I knew growing up was hard work. At the time, I didn't appreciate it, but it was a great way to grow up. A lot of fun, a lot of family togetherness. As Mom would say, when we were in the tobacco barn on Thanksgiving, instead of having a Thanksgiving meal, we'd be there handing off tobacco. She'd say, "Oh, this is family togetherness. Aren't we having fun?" So that's the way I grew up. And of course, I came to Greenback to school all 12 years. Miss Thelma was one of my teachers, my English teachers. But what I remember even more, a little farther back, is her mother-in-law, Miss Carrie Cooper. And there are just so many things that Miss Carrie told us all that we'll never forget. One of them was, "I would rather wear out than rust out any day." And so that's kind of my motto and my mantra, and I'm still working at whatever I can, because I would rather wear out. Her favorite Bible verse, and she repeated it often, was, "There is a time for every, and a season for everything under heaven." And I don't think there's anybody that went through under Miss Carrie that doesn't remember those 2 things about her. Everything someone mentions reminds me of something. When Ronnie mentioned Bruce Hinton, that was one of the most honest men I ever knew in my life. He really made an impression on everyone that he met. Bruce made the wooden things that are here in the library now, all of these wooden cutout things. After he retired, he made Bruce made those and gave them to the community of Greenback. But he left such an impression on me because he was such an honest man. And this is a fact. His wife, Betty, was not allowed to pick up apples that fell in their yard because they didn't come off of his tree. And I'll never forget that. My mom always thought that was the strangest thing, that Betty couldn't use those apples when they fell in her yard because Bruce says, "No, those aren't ours." That church really is so special to me, and all the people there are as well. My mom and Dad didn't want us to be disrespectful of older people, so we called everybody Aunt and Uncle. It was Uncle John Woods and Aunt Nettie, Uncle John Hammondtree. Everybody was Aunt and Uncle in the church. And when my sister married Andy McCall, everybody in the community thought it was terrible because she was marrying her cousin. Because we'd always called his mother and daddy Aunt and Uncle Kyle. And they thought Jean was marrying her cousin, but we were no relation at all. As a little friend of mine said later, they were just my church aunts and my church uncles. But people in that church were very, very dear and left just a wonderful, lasting impression on us growing up. One, though, I think is kind of funny. Miss May Lowry used to wear fox fur around her neck, and it still had the fox head on it. And the thing came around and it clipped in the back, so that us children would be sitting there in the back looking at that little fox face during Sunday school, and it would scare us to death. When you were telling the story about your Uncle Bose, who was walking across the railroad track and was run over, it reminded me of one of Uncle John's stories. He was sitting at the railroad track waiting for the train to go by one day, and he ran into the train.
Yeah, the caboose.
His little car he ran into the train. Didn't hurt him, didn't hurt the car. But they asked him about it after, and he says, "Why? I never moved. That train just vibrated me into it." I graduated from high school, and my parents didn't think girls should go to school, but I loved school, and I really wanted to go to college, and I didn't have any other options at the time. So they finally agreed, and I went to Hiawassee, and I finished a 2-year program in 1 year. I had an AA degree, and then I worked in insurance for just about a year, then got married. Finally, after Myron's youngest was in kindergarten, I went back to school and got my teaching degree.
Is that right?
And then went on and got my master's degree later while I had the kids, and I taught for 20 years. But then came the first grandchild, and I said, "Ronnie, can I quit?" And so I quit 22 years ago, quit teaching, and started staying home with grandchildren 5 days or more a week, and I've done that for 22 years now. Our family didn't really shop in Greenback a whole lot. We raised most of what we needed on the farm. We killed hogs, we had chickens, we had turkeys, we had just about anything that you needed on the farm. Also, we grew a lot of vegetables. My mom and dad had 3 girls before they finally got the boy they wanted to help dad farm. And so she taught us to can. We canned tomatoes, and one summer we put up over 365 quarts of green beans. So we did a lot of canning, and we had a lot of our own food. We raised potatoes and kept them in a bin in the old smokehouse with lime over them to keep them from sprouting, and it was dark in there. So we had most of our food, but my mother and aunt were 2 of the few women in Greenback at that time who drove. So because we were from Alcoa, if we really needed groceries, we'd go to Merrill or Alcoa and get our groceries there. But one thing I do remember is that there was an old red rolling store that would come down the country roads, and we called it the rolling store, but it was just an old red panel truck. And I don't remember who drove it or anything, but as a little girl I can remember. Who?
Bruner
Brookshire. Okay, well I can just remember as a little girl walking down on it in front of our barn on the old road there, which is now called Jackson Ferry Road. But we walked down there, and he would open up the back of his truck, and Mother would sometimes get flour or shortening, although we rendered our own lard too, Willie Clyde. But this shortening made a lot better cakes than that lard did. It had a peculiar taste, especially after it got a little bit older. So I can remember doing that. If this is an appropriate place, I'd like to talk about some of the stories in Greenback from an earlier perspective.
Yes.
I volunteer in the museum, and when I'm there, I love to look through things that are there. And I found an old McInturf family history and an account by Emily McInturf Martin of the stores in Greenback in the 1930s, and I'd like to share that if I could. She says, "Our family moved to Greenback in November 1932. We children were excited because we thought we'd move to a big town. We'd never lived where there were so many businesses. Let me take you for a walk in downtown Greenback in 1932. Starting our walk at the southwest corner, we had Bob Cook's Greenback drugstore, followed by Ed Peterson's grocery store, Charlie McCall's hardware, and John Best's general merchandise. Located behind his store was Kirby Thompson's Hotel, which very few people even remember. The hotel was primarily used by salesmen, or drummers as they were called, who came by train to Greenback to sell their wares. The next building on the street would be the Merchants and Farmers Bank, followed by the Greenback Post Office. Miss Sam McCollum was designated as the postmistress, and the rural route mail carrier was Will Woods, and then later Glenn Weir. Walking past the post office, the next business was Stapp's Barber Shop. Next to the barber shop was a big 2-story house where the Stapps lived on the first floor and the Malacotes lived on the second floor. Crossing the street, you would encounter the Hall family residence. Walking west on the other side of the street, you'd encounter P.K. Greenway's garage and service station. If one had the money for a new Ford, he also owned the Ford dealership. There were no automobiles on display, but you could order one from him. Behind the service station was Swaney's merchandise store. That's King's department store you talked about. Then came the L&N Depot. The L&N steam engine locomotive came through every morning around 9 a.m. and headed south on its way to Chattanooga. What couldn't be purchased in Greenback or Madisonville could be ordered from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Mr. Thomas was the depot agent at that time. A couple of years later, he was replaced by Squire Billy Jones. Couples came from miles around to be married by Squire Jones. Concluding our little walk through town, we crossed the railroad tracks and end up at the Greenback grain mill. Many of the local farmers brought their grain there to be ground. I can remember bringing flour up to the mill or bringing wheat from our house and getting meal ground at the mill there. But what I remember that building as later was the coal yard. This is the building that now houses a church, but Howard Brooks had a coal yard there, and we had a big old furnace in the basement of our house, and that's how we heated the house. So we would get coal at the coal yard there. Many of the other stores are in the 1950s were the same, but some had changed. The drugstore had those red plastic stools that turn round and round where you sit at the counter, and Mr. Fred Cook or Dessler Byerly would give you a nickel cone of ice cream and it'd pile it high.
That's what they did.
Yeah. We loved to do that. Another building that I remember especially shopping in, we didn't shop in Greenback a whole lot. I can remember the A and B store when I was in high school as being a great place where you could raise money. They'd let you put a jar up in there if you were running for homecoming queen or something like that. They'd let you put your jar up in there and they would collect money for you. But the old hardware store just really sticks out in my memory. It had the great big wide plank floors and they were oiled. And so when you stepped in that store, there was just this smell about that. And then I remember the big old bins of nails. We would buy nails by the pound. They would give you a little brown bag and you would fill it up with nails. And so we'd get nails and screws and things like that there. And there was always a group of men sitting around the big old pot-bellied stove in there. One of them was Mr. Wilson, whittling. And I remember seeing them spit their tobacco juice onto that pot-bellied stove, and it would just sizzle. I would just stand there and watch. But a lot of things, as I say, had remained the same. Some had changed by the 50s. There weren't as many stores as Ms. McInturf talks about, but they were good ones. And back where they wash dishes now in the diner used to be the drugstore. It was a separate little area back there, and Mr. Cook would fill prescriptions back in there. And they would even deliver medicine to your home. I remember a time or two they did that. They'd bring it down to the farm to us. If we called after hours, Dessler or Fred, one would go up, get medicine, and bring it down to your home. Games that I remember when I was little, one thing that stands out in my memory is we had an uncle who would come from Maryville and cut our grass for us. When he cut the grass, we would take the grass clippings and pile them up and make walls and doll houses. We would cut paper dolls out of the Sears Roebuck catalog, and then that's how we girls would play out in the yard by building a prettier house than the other. Two things that I remember too, though, my dad worked so hard. He worked at Alcoa and he farmed, and so he just hardly ever even got to sit down. But on Sundays, Dad would play with us. One thing he did, he made the first kite I ever flew. He took newspaper and a couple of sticks of wood and tied them together in a cross, and then he put the newspaper over that, those sheets of newspaper, and then he made a tail for that kite out of old rags. And that thing just flew as high. We'd go up on the top of the hill over there at the farm, and that really was one of the best kites I've ever had. But Dad liked to fly kites. And then on Sunday afternoon, we would have friends come home with us from church, and we would get in a big baseball game. There would be enough for 2 baseball teams, just the kids that would come down on Sunday afternoon to play baseball with us. But it was in the middle of a pasture field. And so you ran uphill to first base, downhill to second, uphill to third, and downhill to home. But it was a good game.
Yeah. Judy's dad and her uncle even built a bike stop. That was there for the, it was an official field.
Our lot between us and Junior and them, that was their ball field, and they could hit it out of the block. She could beat them boys off the bases.
Other than that, we rode bikes a lot around the farm and rode horses and shot a lot of basketball, just anything you could find to do. But I remember when we got our first television set, and we actually got it through the drugstore. I don't remember exactly how, but Dessler Byerly sold televisions.
He sold them.
Yeah, so we got our first television through there. When I was a little bit older, I had a cousin, and he and I thought we were Roy Rogers and Dale Evans.
Yeah.
So we would play and pretend to be Roy and Dale. One I wouldn't call, well, I guess she was a character too, Minnie Mouse. She had a greater influence on our community, I think, than most any person I can think of. She was the niece of Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House from Texas. And he was unmarried, and so she was his hostess, so she was used to formal affairs. I don't know how she got to Greenback and married Glenn McTeer, but she did. And once she got to Greenback, she brought a lot of that culture with her. I understand that when she first got here, the young girls, and I don't know if you were one of them or not, but she would have these formal tea parties.
Yeah,
and they had to wear gloves and they had to wear hats. You've been there?
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of people tell about that. Well, we knew Miss Minnie too. We knew her as the Nazi of the cafeteria. She started the nutrition program at Greenback School. She could do a lot of things.
Charles Warner Everett, she's going to marry Priscilla from Loudon, and she had a tea for her in her house.
But she was always a very social person.
Invited to the team.
and through the church, it was Miss Minnie that was always having the teas and made sure that it was all very formal and just very well done. But she was the nutritionist at school for, I guess, 45 years or so. Ran the cafeteria there. She started the first cafeteria there, as I understand it, at Greenback, and did an excellent job. But of course, we kind of found little tricks, like when she had her clean plate club and you had to eat everything on your plate. We learned you could drink your milk and stick it in them carton and get by with that.
She made Danny eat liver, and he never did forgive her.
She'd make you eat all. It was very strict.
He would give his to Kirby's.
And if we got a little too loud in the cafeteria, those lights would go off and her neck would turn red. We all would cringe. But Miss Minnie was one you just did not forget. But she also began the library program in Greenback up over the old bank, in the back of the bank building, when it was the brick building on the corner across from the stores, the Emergence Farmers Bank. On the upstairs, there was an old room up there. You went up some pretty steep dark steps, and you went upstairs, and it opened up into a large room. And through Fort Loudon Regional Library Service, they would bring books to the community, and she set up a library up there. And so on Saturdays, us kids would get to go to the library and pick out a book, and she always had cookies that Miss Sam McCollum made, and we called it Minnie's Pond Water. It wasn't, it was punch. But because McTeer's Pond is over on McTeer Road, and it looked about the same color as the pond, we always called it pond water, not to her face. But she was a great individual. I was raised by committee. There were four families living in one house when we first moved to Greenback. So my Aunt Betty and Uncle Kenneth, my Aunt Joe and Uncle Frank, and my mom and dad, and my grandpa, I had to answer to all of them, but they all had their own personalities and their own particular influence on my life, but every one of them taught me to work. We had a great work ethic. Grandpa used to say, well, if I was him, I'd have to back up to get my paycheck. So I was influenced greatly by them. Also, their honesty and compassion, some of them less than others, but I would have to give a lot of credit to my family. One other influence that I remember as a teen, though, was Dr. Al Croft, who moved to Greenback as the Presbyterian minister when I was a teenager, and he had come from an Indian reservation. I don't know why, but Dr. Al had one eye, And he was crippled. One leg was shorter than the other. He wore a big platform shoe on one foot. But he was such a personality. He looked like Santa Claus to me. He was always smiling. But he taught us so many important things about our faith and our doctrine that I have never forgotten. The Apostles' Creed, just so many things like that I learned under Dr. Croft, and it's had a great influence on my life.
That's good.
As for me, if I could leave a legacy, it would be a legacy of love. I've always felt loved by the community, by my family, by friends, and to me, that's the greatest thing there is. So if I could leave a legacy of love to others, that's what I'd like to leave.
That's good. I'm going to end up with, I know you're in the process of doing the research to write a book. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, it started out as just remembering stories. Ronnie's daddy was one of the great storytellers, he and Fred Phipps, and they just loved to tell stories, and I just loved to hear them. So I started to write them down, and then the more I listened, the more I found these funny stories. To me, they're funny, and things we could remember about Greenback. So I said, we need to write these down. So I began writing, and I have, 40 or 50 pages of stories now. But then my cousin Anita got involved, and she said, well, we need to have everybody's family history to go with it. So she's done a lot of genealogy, and she wants it to be a book that is everything Greenback. It combines genealogy and the stories and all of that. So we're kind of waiting to get that all together, but hopefully we'll get it done. And our aim is that we might be able to publish a book. I love going to the museum and working because I can sit there and pour through all these things that are there. But most people don't have time to do that. But if we can hand them a book that they can take home with them and look at in their leisure and learn more about their heritage and learn more about Greenback as it used to be and our memories of it, I think they'd be enriched by that. So that's what our hope is in the book.
What kind of stories are you after?
Oh, we'll take any story that comes up at all, and just anything that's interesting, but we especially like the funny ones. Uncle John Woods just gave us all kinds of fodder because he had a hard time driving, evidently.
Tell my boys, stay out of the road. You see Uncle
stay out
John
of the road.
coming.
Yeah, we couldn't go out in the church
All the
parking
wrecks
lot
that he
until
had,
left.
and it was just funny. All stories that Alfred Hammondtree told about some of the black people in the community, that just hilarious stories. Like Bish Irwin one time after a wagon wreck and a horse drug him through town, the boys finally got the horse stopped, and Bish got up and says, "Whew, boys, that plump there scared me white." Just things
They
like
had
that.
to turn his bug in
Yeah.
Greenback.
Yeah, those are the old stories of Greenback that we love.